Welcome back to Unsaid Hours, and yes, I see you getting cozy. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. If these stories hit different for you, smash that like button and subscribe. Now settle in, breathe, and let's get into it. My father is not a man who performs for an audience. He has zero interest in being believed the way people who exaggerate need to be believed. When he recounts something that happened, he delivers it the way a witness delivers testimony. Flat, precise, deliberate. Not because he rehearsed it, but because certain memories get turned over so many times that everything unnecessary burns away, leaving only the raw, true shape underneath. He told me this story once. He asked me to protect the names and the location. Not out of embarrassment, he was clear about that, but out of something closer to respect or caution. The particular reluctance of a man who has quietly carried something for decades and isn't entirely sure what happens when you finally give it too much air. He was around 12. Summer. The kind of long, unstructured day that kids back then owned completely. Hours that belonged to no one but themselves, with no destination and no agenda beyond filling the time. He and his closest friend decided to go fishing at the river near their home. They'd done it plenty of times. The river was one of those places that becomes furniture in a childhood. Familiar, unremarkable, as ordinary as a backyard. A wooden dock, slow, moving water. The kind of peace that makes a place feel like nothing bad has ever happened there. So they baited the hooks and cast their lines. And because they were 12 and the afternoon was endless, and sitting still waiting for a fish is never as fun as moving, they chained the rods to the dock so nothing could drag them in and wandered down the sandy shore. Standard procedure. You secure the line. You give yourself room. You come back when something pulls. What happened next began exactly the way so many unexplainable things begin, as something completely meaningless. One of them suggested, the way bored kids suggest things, that they do a summoning ritual for fish. A joke. A piece of theater with no audience but themselves, and no stakes beyond the next few minutes of entertainment. These were not children who believed in anything supernatural. They were 12 years old, on a familiar river, on an ordinary afternoon. The ritual was born from too much imagination and not enough to do. They drew shapes in the sand, rough, approximate, half remembered from some comic or movie, or the general cultural noise of childhood. They stood over the shapes and chanted, and they laughed while they did it, because of course they did. Because it was a joke, and they knew it was a joke, and nothing in either of their lives had ever suggested that jokes like this could actually reach something. Then they finished. The laughter settled, and one of the rods snapped tight. The speed of it was wrong. That was the first thing, before any other detail, before any attempt at explanation. The speed was wrong. Not the speed of a fish taking a hook. Not the measured pull of a living thing being caught. The line went from slack to savagely taut in an instant, the rod bowing hard against the chain holding it to the dock. Then the hook tore free, the line snapped, and the surface of the river, calm, undisturbed, as if nothing had been there at all. They'd both fished enough to know what a large catch looked like on a line. The rhythm of the fight, the splashing, the lateral movement, the way the water responds to something alive and resisting. This was none of that. The force had traveled straight down, and then upstream, against the current, and the water above it hadn't moved. The second rod went before either of them had spoken a word. The same force, traveling upstream from where the first hook had been, hit the second line with that same sudden violence, same absence of visible cause, same clean snap. Then nothing. The river was still, perfectly still. the surface reflecting the sky like a mirror. Whatever had moved through that water left no evidence of itself behind, except two severed lines hanging limp from the dock and two boys on the shore who had stopped making any sound at all. My father told me they waited. They stood there watching the water, expecting something to surface, expecting the ordinary explanation to show itself. A large fish rolling to the top, a dark shape in the shallows, anything their world could produce to account for what had just happened. The water gave them nothing. He said they didn't discuss it. No theories, no attempts to talk each other into reason. They just gathered their things and left, walking quickly, not running, because running would have meant fully acknowledging what they were feeling, and neither of them was ready to go there. They glanced back at the river more than once. That feeling of being watched, sourceless and persistent, following them down the path all the way home. The years passed the way years pass, burying things under the ordinary weight of a life. My father grew up, moved through adulthood, built distance from the boy he'd been on that riverbank. But the memory didn't fade the way childhood memories usually do. It kept its clarity. He and his friend returned to it across the years, the way two people return to a shared experience that was never fully resolved, hoping that age might finally offer them something. It never did. He told me this story in a room we were sharing, just the two of us, one evening. Quiet, deliberate. No dramatization, no reaching for effect. He spoke like a man giving a witness account, not a man performing a story. And I listened the way you listen when you understand the person speaking isn't trying to entertain you. They're handing you something they've been carrying for a very long time. He was partway through when the smell arrived. No gradual build, no seeping in from somewhere. One moment it simply wasn't there, and the next, it was filling the room, completely, leaving no corner of the air untouched. I've tried to describe this smell many times since, and nothing feels adequate. The closest I can get imagine something deeply biological and wrong. Decay and sulfur combined, something that had no business existing in a living space, existing there fully and without apology. Not faint, not the kind of thing where you wonder if you're imagining it. It was present in the way very few things are. Demanding attention, impossible to set aside. We both reacted at the exact same moment. There was no question of one of us perceiving something the other wasn't. We looked at each other, and we both knew we were in the same experience. We searched. Bathroom, vents, corners, our own clothes, the space under the furniture. Moving systematically, the way rational people respond to a problem, they expect to find a rational solution to. But this smell didn't behave like a smell with a source. It moved. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be tracked. But it shifted as we moved through the room. Never strongest in one place, never absent from another, as if it were being carried by something that was also moving. Something that occupied the space with us, but wasn't fixed to it. I watched my father's face change as we searched. He was not a man who frightened easily. What I saw wasn't exactly fear. It was something adjacent. Recognition. The look of someone who has encountered a thing before, spent years hoping never to encounter it again, and is now confronted with the possibility that it has found him. He went quiet. Then, he said he was going to pray. He wasn't a particularly religious man in his daily life. He believed, but he held it privately and lightly, without ceremony. But something in that room, in that moment, moved him toward something older and more instinctive than his ordinary relationship with faith. He began reciting prayers learned in childhood and kept somewhere below the level of regular use. His voice steady and serious, not performing for my benefit, but doing what he had decided needed to be done, I watched the room and said nothing. The smell left, not gradually, not the way an odor disperses when a window opens, thinning at the edges until it becomes bearable. It stopped. Between one moment and the next, the air was ordinary, clean, unremarkable, carrying no trace of what had been so insistently present the moment before. The transition was absolute, and we both felt it with the same completeness with which we'd both felt the smell arrive. We stood in the silence afterward. Neither of us moved to check again, because there was nothing left to check. No source to find, because there was nothing there anymore. The room was simply a room. My father looked shaken in a way I had never seen before. Not undone, not the shaking of someone who has completely lost their footing, more like someone who has just received a confirmation they did not want and cannot now unreceive. He had told this story to very few people across his lifetime. He had carried it carefully and privately, turning it over for decades. And now, in the act of telling it, something had happened that felt, regardless of what it actually was, like a response. I have thought about what to do with all of this for years. Not obsessively, but quietly, in the background, the way unresolved things occupy the mind that has not yet found a container for them. I don't know what moved through that river. I've considered the ordinary explanations. A large fish powerful enough to snap two lines in quick succession, an unusual current mimicking deliberate force. I hold those explanations up against the details that resist them most stubbornly. The upstream movement against the current, the completely undisturbed surface, the precise sequence. The explanations don't fit without bending the details into shapes they were never reported in. And my father is not a man who bends details. I don't know what filled that room with a smell, and then removed it between one breath and the next. I don't know what it means that these two things exist in the same story, connected by nothing except my father's memory of a joke made on a riverbank by a child who didn't believe the joke could reach anything. What I know is what I witnessed. A man who doesn't tell stories for effect, telling one that had clearly cost him something to carry, and a room that responded to the telling in a way that I have never been satisfied explaining. I think about those two boys on the shore, watching the water for something that never surfaced, standing in a silence that had gone wrong, gathering their things and walking quickly away without speaking, glancing back at a river that looked exactly as it always had, as if nothing had moved through it, as if nothing was still there. Water holds no record of what passes through it. It closes over, returns to itself, gives nothing back to the surface. Whatever took those hooks that afternoon left no shape, no sign, nothing that could be held or named or taken home. Only the memory, which is what everything leaves in the end, in the people who were present for it. Sharp, intact, and without resolution, waiting to be carried forward into rooms where other people are sleeping, and the night is quiet. And the air is, for the moment, perfectly still. The house I grew up in was the kind of place that felt completely ordinary in daylight. A rural road. The kind where cars might pass twice an hour if you were lucky. And the gaps between neighbors were wide enough that you couldn't see their porch lights from our windows at night. Peaceful during the day. Trees, open space, that particular countryside quiet that people in cities literally pay money to experience. But the house had a feature I never thought twice about as a child. Because when you grow up with something, it just becomes part of the architecture of your life. It becomes normal. My bedroom sat right up against an attached shed, not a detached outbuilding across a yard. Something built into the structure itself, sharing a wall, sharing a roof. And the way the house was laid out, There were glass doors in my room that opened directly into that shed. 2 panes of glass, a metal handle, a thin lock. And on the other side, tools, shadows, cold air that smelled like motor oil and rust. I never thought of those doors as a vulnerability. They were just doors. I'd opened them 100 times as a younger child, peeked inside, and nothing bad had ever been on the other side, so my brain filed them away as neutral. Background furniture, like the walls. I was 12, maybe just turned 13, somewhere around 2002, when I first heard the footsteps. It started small, the way these things always do, when they're building towards something that hasn't happened yet. A sound late at night, after my parents had gone to bed and the house had gone fully quiet. Footsteps in the shed, not loud, not dramatic, just the soft, irregular creak and scrape of weight moving on a wooden floor just beyond the glass. The first time, I told myself it was the house settling. Old houses do that. They expand and contract with temperature. They shift. They groan in ways that sound almost human if you're tired enough and the room is dark enough. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The second night, I heard it again. By the third or fourth night, I had stopped trying to sleep and started watching the doors instead, lying in bed with the covers pulled up, staring at those glass panes, waiting. The shed was dark. I couldn't see much. But sometimes, when a cloud shifted and the moon hit just right, there was enough ambient light to make out shapes. One night, while I was lying there watching, I saw it. A figure, moving back and forth in the darkness on the other side of the glass. Not running, not crouched, walking, slowly, back and forth. The way a person walks when they're waiting for something, or working themselves up to something. The shape of a person, unhurried, in my shed, in the middle of the night, just feet from where I was lying. I flew out of bed and down the hall to my parents' room. My mom got up with me. My dad too, grumbling the way parents do when they've been dragged out of sleep for the third time. They went into the shed with a flashlight while I waited in the hallway, listening. A few minutes later, they came back. Nothing. No one there. The doors were latched from the inside. No forced entry, no footprints, nothing out of place that couldn't be explained by the ordinary disorder of a tool shed. My dad said it was an animal, or the wind, or my imagination, with the flat certainty of someone who had already decided which answer he preferred. I went back to my room. A week later I woke them again, and then again after that. Each time, empty shed, nothing there. My dad's patience, never a vast resource, was wearing down to something harder. I could see it in how he got up, in the set of his shoulders, in the shortness of his words. A man who needed his sleep, who believed in practical explanations. And a child who kept insisting something was wrong in a place where he could find no evidence of anything being wrong. One night, after yet another fruitless sweep of the shed, he slapped me across the face. Not a beating, one sharp, flat-handed slap. The kind that communicates frustration more than punishment. The kind that leaves no mark, but stays with you. He told me I was being dramatic. He told me to go to sleep and stop waking people up. I went back to my room, sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, pressing my hand against my cheek, and I felt something settle in me that I didn't have a name for at the time. It wasn't just the sting or the humiliation. It was something more like the closing of a door. The understanding that I was alone in this, that whatever was happening on the other side of those glass panes, I was going to have to manage it by myself because the people who were supposed to believe me had decided not to. I stopped going to their room after that. Not because the noises stopped, because there was no longer any point. Instead, I started building small defenses. I pushed my bed across the room, until its frame pressed flush against the glass doors. If someone tried to open them, they'd have to push through my bed first. That small delay felt like the difference between helpless and not quite helpless. I found a piece of scrap rebar around the property, thick, heavy, cold, and slid it under the mattress where I could grab it fast. I was 13. I didn't know what I'd actually do with it. But holding it in the dark felt like something. A quiet declaration that I wasn't entirely without options. The figure kept coming. 3 nights a week, sometimes 4, sometimes more. Always late, always after the house had gone fully silent. I'd hear the footsteps, and I'd lie perfectly still and wait. Sometimes I'd see the shape moving through the glass. Sometimes I'd hear the door handle being tested. Not aggressively, not rattling and shaking, but slowly, carefully. A slow, deliberate pull, a pause, another pull. The behavior of someone who isn't in a hurry because they have all the time they need. Every time I switched on my bedside lamp, the sound stopped. Every time I aimed a flashlight at the glass, the shape pulled back into the deeper dark of the shed and vanished. So I started sleeping with the lamp on, which meant I barely slept at all. Which meant the circles under my eyes darkened, my focus in school thinned, my temper shortened. And from the outside, I started to look like a child who was struggling in ways that had no obvious cause. Then came the doubt, and that was the worst part of all of it. Worse than the fear, worse than the sleeplessness, worse than the slap. After months of being told nothing was there, after months of empty sheds and no evidence and patient adult faces explaining reality back to me, I started to wonder if they were right. Fear can look like imagination when you're tired enough. When something repeats and no one around you confirms it, the line between real and not real starts to blur. I would lie in bed after hearing the footsteps and think, maybe it is an animal, maybe it is the house, maybe I am the problem. That quiet internal erosion was its own kind of damage, separate from whatever was happening just beyond the glass. 6 months in, on an ordinary school day in the middle of the week, my dad came to pick me up early. Didn't explain much on the drive home, just that we needed to talk to the police when we got there. My first reaction, I'm a little ashamed to admit, was that I was in trouble. My brain, worn down by months of poor sleep and self-doubt, immediately went to the most self-punishing explanation it could find. I thought I was being arrested for lying, for causing trouble, for all those nights I'd woken people up. When we turned onto our road and I saw the police cars, multiple of them, lights off but unmistakable in the driveway, I felt my stomach drop through the seat. My mom met us outside and pulled me away from the cars, talking to me quietly until I stopped shaking. She explained what had happened that morning. My dad had gone into the shed to grab some tools, and he'd noticed, with the sharpness of someone who knows where things belong, that several items were missing. Expensive items, things that don't just wander off. He called the police, then mentioned it to a neighbor, the way you do in rural areas when something goes wrong. Both as a warning and a reaching out. The neighbor's response was not what my dad expected. The man went quiet in the specific way of someone who already knows the answer to the question being asked. He said his son might have taken the tools. He said they had a problem with him. With money, with drugs, with choices that kept getting worse. He asked my dad not to call the police. He said they'd pay for everything. My dad said no. He wanted answers more than he wanted money. The police searched the son's room, and what they found there was the moment when everything that had been one kind of story became a completely different kind of story. They found the stolen tools. They found evidence of drug use, but they also found photographs. Some of them were school photos of me, the kind that come in small wallet-sized prints, sent home in envelopes, ending up in frames on relatives' walls. Someone had taken those photos. They had no business being in that room. And alongside them, other photographs. Photographs taken on our property. Photographs that captured angles and distances that only made sense if the person taking them had been close. Very close. Some of them were taken at night. Some of them showed the interior of my bedroom through the glass doors. He had been there. Not an animal, not the house settling, not my imagination unraveling in the dark. A person, a neighbor's son, someone I had probably seen before, passed on the road, caught at the end of a driveway. Someone who existed in the ordinary background of rural life and had been using that ordinariness as cover. He had been in that shed, in the dark, on the other side of those glass doors. 3 and 4 nights a week for 6 months. The police believed the tool theft was a secondary behavior. Something opportunistic added on top of the original reason he was coming. The tools were not why he was there. He was there before the tools became interesting. When I understood that, when the full shape of it became clear, I felt something I don't have a clean word for. Not just fear, not just relief, not just the exhaustion of being proven right after being so completely told you were wrong. It was more physical than any of those things. A cold, spreading sensation, like swallowing something made of ice. All those nights I had pressed my bed against those doors. All those nights I had held the rebar in the dark and listened to that handle being tested. Slowly, patiently, by someone who was waiting for a night the light didn't come on. Someone who had photographs. Someone who had been building something in his head about me across 6 months of standing outside my glass doors in the dark. What he had been building, I still don't let myself think about for very long. The thoughts are too heavy, too specific, too close to something that didn't happen only because of the particular luck of me being a light sleeper. Of the bed pressed against the door, of the lamp I'd started leaving on. Small things, fragile things, the kind that could just as easily have gone the other way on any given night. My parents were devastated in the way people are devastated when they realize the error they made was not a small one. They had dismissed me, made me feel crazy for telling the truth. My dad had slapped me for being afraid of something real. The apologies that followed were genuine, months of them. And I could see they were sitting with something heavy that wasn't going to lift easily. Even now, years removed from all of it, they still carry it. I tease them about it sometimes, carefully. The way you handle something that's healed but left a tender spot. I never went to court. The police recorded me on video. Me recounting everything in the order it happened. And that recording was enough for the purposes of the case. I didn't want to sit in a room and look at him. I still don't know what happened to him legally. What sentence was given or served. What his life looks like now. I made a deliberate decision not to find out. I hope he got help. I hope the specific thing he had been building toward in his head over those 6 months never found another target. That's the most generous version of what I hope. On good days, I manage it. After everything settled, after the police cars left, and the shed was searched, and the photographs became evidence, and my bedroom stopped being the place where I was alone with something I couldn't prove. My parents did something small and unexpected. They let me get mice. Pet mice. Something I'd been asking about for a while, and had previously been a flat no. I think they needed to do something kind for me. Needed to make an offering. And the mice were what they could give. One of them was named Paprika, Papy for short. Small and rust-colored and completely unbothered by the world, I kept him for 6 years, which is an unusual lifespan for a mouse, and which felt meaningful in ways I couldn't quite articulate at 13, but can almost articulate now. Taking care of him gave me something to do with my hands in the early mornings when I woke up too early, and the quiet felt wrong. He'd come to the side of the cage when I pressed my finger against the bars. Warm and alive and present, in the specific ways small animals are. Without agenda, without the complicated weight of human interaction. He was the reason I eventually understood I wanted to work with animals. Not in a sudden revelation, but slowly, the way most real things unfold. One ordinary morning at a time. The memory of that period still lives close to the surface even now. Not loud, not dramatic. It arrives quietly, the way the most stubborn memories do. When I see glass doors, or hear an unfamiliar sound at night, or watch a child try to explain something that an adult has already decided isn't real, it arrives as a reminder of what it costs when fear gets labeled as imagination. When a child's testimony is weighed against the absence of visible evidence and found wanting, it arrives as a reminder that the most frightening things are not always the ones that announce themselves loudly. Sometimes the most frightening thing is just a shape, patient and quiet. On the other side of the glass, the house I grew up in existed before I did, which is obvious and unremarkable. The way most obvious things are until they aren't. Every house carries a life before its current occupants. Rooms that held other furniture. Walls that absorbed other conversations. Thresholds crossed by people who are now gone. I never thought about any of that as a child. It was simply home, familiar in every corner, safe in the particular way that childhood homes are safe. Before you develop the vocabulary to understand that safety is not a permanent feature of a place, but something that gets built and sometimes quietly dismantled. My mother told me the first story so many times that it settled into my memory as though I'd been there, which I hadn't. I wasn't yet born. She was young, playing inside the house with my cousin, who was 2 or 3 at the time, young enough that the world was still mostly sensation and response, without much narrative threading between them. They were doing something simple, tossing something back and forth, the easy repetitive play that fills a child's afternoon without needing rules or names. The house was calm. The middle of the day. Nothing in any direction that suggested anything other than an ordinary hour. My mother threw the object down the hallway. My cousin ran after it. She waited. A few seconds passed, perhaps longer, the kind of pause that only registers because of what came after it. Then he came running back, not trotting, not walking, running, with the full body commitment of a small child who has encountered something his body needs distance from before his mind has finished identifying it. And he was screaming, not crying, not the ordinary complaint of a toddler who's bumped into something. Screaming in the specific register of pure terror, the kind of child that age produces when something has reached past their limited understanding of the world and touched something beneath it. She grabbed him, held him, tried to slow him down enough to understand. And through the gasping and the crying, he told her, an old man standing at the door. She went to the front door immediately, still holding him, and opened it. The street was empty. Not the emptiness of a place where someone has just left, where you'd expect a retreating figure or fading footsteps. Simply empty, as though nothing had been there at all. She stepped outside, looked both directions, checked the side of the house, the doorway, found nothing that could account for what he had seen. Eventually, she made herself accept the explanation easiest to live with. That he had seen a shadow, that he'd frightened himself, that the imagination of a too year old was a vivid and unreliable instrument, but the fear on his face stayed with her. She told my father that evening. His reaction was not what she expected. She had anticipated quick dismissal. The comfortable rationalism of a person who hasn't been frightened and therefore has no investment in taking the frightening seriously. Instead, he went quiet. Not the quiet of someone thinking about what to say. The heavier quiet of a person dealing with something they've been carrying privately and have now been given a reason to set down. He told her, after a moment, that he thought he had seen an old man too. The air in that room must have changed. My mother told me she felt a change, that the space between those words and whatever came next had a weight. She still remembered clearly decades later. Then, a beat too quickly, my father added that he meant he had seen an old man in the mirror. A reflection misread, his own face caught at an angle, his features assembling into something unfamiliar for a fraction of a second before resolving back into himself. He said it with a small laugh. The way you package something that isn't quite a joke inside the shape of one. She told me she never believed that explanation. Not because my father was dishonest, but because of the pause before it. The quality of the quiet that preceded it wasn't the quiet of someone constructing a story. It was the quiet of someone deciding how much of the truth to offer. I grew up in that house knowing none of this. Children are never handed the full inventory of a place when they arrive in it. You inhabit the surface, and the history lies underneath, and the two rarely intersect in any legible way until you're old enough to know what questions to ask. The house never felt frightening to me. It felt like home, which is a specific feeling that has more to do with repetition and familiarity than the actual character of a place. I moved through its rooms the way you move through spaces that have become extensions of your own body, without attention, without interrogation. I was 13 when the next thing happened. My sister was 10. It was a day like most of the days we spent in those woods. Unremarkable in its beginning, one of dozens of bike rides through paths we knew well enough that the riding required almost no thought. The woods were a serious part of our childhood, the way woods are when they border the house you grow up in. We knew which paths looped back, and which went deep enough that the sound of roads and houses disappeared completely. That day we rode deeper than usual, not from any deliberate decision. The way rides sometimes extend themselves. When the weather is right and neither person is in a hurry to stop, we followed a path into a quieter section. Denser trees, the light shifting to that filtered, green quality of a place that doesn't see much direct sun. There was a bench. I noticed it because it was wrong. In the specific way things are wrong when they exist where they have no business existing. Not near a road, not near a clearing, not at a spot where someone would naturally stop for a view or a rest. It sat against the trees in a part of the path that offered no obvious purpose for sitting. Nothing to look at that would recommend itself to a person who had brought something to draw and chosen this spot to do it. And on the bench sat an old man, doing exactly that. Drawing, head bent over his paper, completely still, completely absorbed, calm and self-contained as a person who has been in a place for a long time and expects to remain there for a long time still. He didn't look frightening. I want to be precise about that. He had the appearance of someone entirely harmless, old enough to be a grandfather, doing something solitary and quiet. He looked as though he belonged there, which was the strange part, because nothing about that location suggested anyone should belong there. My sister fell off her bike before I had finished forming an impression of him. Not the kind of fall that comes from a root catching a tire. The kind that happens when the body has already decided to stop before the mind has caught up. The abrupt, total loss of forward intention that produces a fall rather than a controlled stop. She hit the ground hard and started crying immediately, but the crying had the wrong quality for a skinned knee. Too high, too immediate, the wrong register entirely. She got up and she ran, not toward me, not stopping for her bike, her shoes, or even to look back at where she'd fallen. She ran toward home with the full commitment of someone who is finished being in a place and cannot leave it fast enough. I watched her go. Then I turned back to the old man. He hadn't moved, hadn't looked up at the sound of the fall, the crying, the running. Still bent over his drawing, still entirely contained in whatever he was making. As though nothing had happened in his immediate vicinity at all. I remember thinking this was odd, without quite knowing why. A child falls and cries loudly a few feet from where you're sitting, and you don't look up. You don't check. You continue drawing as though the world has produced nothing worth acknowledging. I collected my sister's bike and her shoes and went home. She had calmed down by the time I arrived. The way children calm down after something has passed through them, the surface going still before you can determine what moved beneath it. Later, talking with our parents, I mentioned the old man casually. The way you mention something you have no reason to think is significant. Something about how it must be pleasant for him, sitting in the woods and drawing. The kind of offhand comment that assumes a shared understanding of who you're talking about. My sister's response was strange in a way I filed away without fully examining at the time. She was dismissive, not interested in discussing the old man or the bench. And her dismissiveness had a particular quality to it. Not ignorance, avoidance. The behavior of someone who knows exactly what you're referring to and has decided not to engage with it. My father looked confused. I assumed he was joking, dry humor expressed through pretended ignorance. I thought this was that. I moved on. Years went by. The memory waited in that middle distance where things that haven't yet declared themselves as significant pause. To be either forgotten or eventually retrieved. I retrieved it eventually. I asked my father in adulthood, expecting him to smile and admit the joke. He didn't smile. He told me he hadn't been joking. He remembered the bike ride, remembered my sister coming home upset, could account for the afternoon in other ways, but he was clear, straightforward, and unambiguous. He had not seen an old man on a bench. He said it the way a person states a fact they have no reason to doubt. Without defensiveness, without the particular quality of someone maintaining a position. He simply had not seen him. He had been on that path, and there had been no bench, and no old man on it. And he was certain the way someone is certain of what their own eyes told them. I thought about his certainty for a long time, several years ago. As an adult with a dog needing a longer walk, I went back, not as a deliberate investigation. I just took a longer route and found myself on the familiar path. The woods had changed in the small ways woods change across decades. Subtle shifts in density, paths slightly altered by seasons and foot traffic, but the fundamental geography was intact and recognizable. I knew the spot when I was approaching it, not because of any clear marker, but because the body remembers in ways the mind can't always articulate. A slight shift in attention as you near a place that has meant something, even if you haven't thought about it in years. There was no bench. I stopped and looked at where it had been, where I was certain it had been. Old trees stood there, their roots thick and spread wide, undisturbed. Not the roots of trees that have grown around something, not the pattern of growth that adapts to an object's presence across decades. Just roots, old, settled, pressing through the soil in the way they press when nothing has ever occupied that space. I walked the path in both directions, applied the logic of a faulty memory that might have shifted the location by 10 or 20 feet, gave myself every opportunity to be wrong about where I was standing. The trees were everywhere the bench should have been. Not recently grown, not newly planted, old, established, the kind that takes longer than my entire lifetime to become what they were. I stood there with my dog pulling at the leash and did the accounting. My cousin, before I existed, screaming about an old man at a door that opened onto an empty street. My father going quiet before constructing an explanation my mother never believed. An old man on a bench in the woods, calm and still, while a child fell and screamed and ran. And my father, who had been on the same path, who saw none of it. A return decades later to a place where the physical evidence refused to support what I remembered. I don't have a framework that contains all of these things simultaneously without leaving gaps. I've tried. You try the way you try to hold an optical illusion in both of its states at once. The vase and the faces, neither one staying stable long enough to become the only truth. It doesn't hold. Something keeps slipping out of place. What I am left with is the image of an old man drawing in a quiet part of the woods. Unhurried, unbothered, sitting on a bench in a place where no bench could have been, his head bent over his paper, with the patience of something that has occupied a particular spot for a very long time, and is not expecting to leave. My dog pulled at the leash. I walked away from those trees and back toward the road. The woods were quiet the way woods are quiet, when there is nothing in them. Or in the way woods are quiet when whatever is in them is not currently making itself known. I have never been fully certain which of those it was that afternoon. I'm still not certain now. There are moments that arrive without warning and install themselves permanently into the structure of a life. Not the ones you see coming. Not the ones that announce themselves with any ceremony. The ones that begin as ordinary afternoons and end as things you carry for the rest of your time. Heavy and unresolved, surfacing without invitation in quiet moments years later. That drive across the dam in southern Idaho was one of those moments for me. I have thought about it more times than I can count, and I have never found a version of the ending that gives me peace. It was about 10 years ago. I was with a close friend, driving across a 2-mile dam that stretched straight and exposed between reservoirs. Water on both sides, the road narrow and open to the sky in a way that gives you the feeling of being briefly suspended between two large things. The dam wasn't unusual. Locals used it constantly. People ran along it, fished from its edges, brought their children to look at the water. It had the casual familiarity of a place that has been ordinary long enough that people stopped noticing it. I had driven it before. It was just a road. The day was clear. The drive was quiet. My friend and I were talking about something I no longer remember. Easy. Half-attentive conversation between two people comfortable enough with each other. That silence and speech alternate without needing management. The water flat on both sides. The road straight ahead. Then I saw her. She was running along the right shoulder. The narrow one. The side where the pavement barely extended before meeting the low barrier at the dam's edge. Cars traveled that road at reasonable speed, the kind that becomes dangerous when there is almost no buffer between moving traffic and a person on foot. My first thought was practical. She had chosen the wrong side. Didn't realize how exposed she was. She would cross when she noticed. People make small errors of judgment on familiar roads. It seemed like something with an easy explanation. But as we got closer, the explanation dissolved. She was not jogging in the loose. rhythmic way of someone out for exercise. Her body was tense, in a way I felt before I could articulate it, the particular tightness of a person holding themselves together through sheer force of will rather than moving freely through space. And she was crying, not the kind you notice at a distance because someone has slowed their pace. Fully, openly crying, her body carrying it without containment. Her movements frantic in a way that had nothing to do with an afternoon run. I had already started to slow the car when she turned. She threw herself onto the hood. I don't mean she stepped into our lane. I mean she turned and threw her body onto the hood with enough force that the impact registered through the steering wheel, through the seat, through my hands and arms, into the part of me that responds to sudden physical events before thought has assembled itself. She hit the hood and screamed at me to stop. And I was already braking, already stopped, my heart running ahead of everything else. Before I had found any words, she came around to the passenger side. She yanked the door open with the urgency of someone executing a decision without allowing herself space to reconsider. And she climbed in. The car was a 1990 Mazda, low and small, a two-door with a cramped interior. And she pressed herself onto the seat on top of my friend without any apparent awareness of the logistics of what she was doing. She was shaking. Her voice when she told me to drive was barely a voice, more like breath shaped into words through sheer necessity. I drove. Neither of us asked why yet. There are moments where the body understands the shape of a situation before the mind has the information to justify that understanding. The way she had come off that road and into the car told us everything we needed to know about whether we should be moving or staying still. We moved. After a few seconds, when she had pulled one breath and then another, my friend and I began to ask gently, was she okay? What happened? What did she need? That was when I registered her shirt. It was white, or it had been white. Large sections of it were soaked dark with blood, the kind of staining that comes from something ongoing rather than a single injury, spread and irregular. The evidence of a body that had been hurt and kept being hurt over time. My grip on the steering wheel changed without my choosing it. She told us in pieces, breathing through the telling. She had been in the car with her boyfriend. He had been beating her. She had jumped out while it was moving. He still had their children with him. The dam stretched ahead. I kept driving and felt the information settle into the space around us and change the quality of everything. The water on both sides, the narrow road, the open sky. 15 minutes to the nearest town. She asked us to take her there. We said we would. My friend said something quiet and reassuring, and I kept my eyes on the road and did not allow myself to think further ahead than the next 100 yards. When we reached the end of the dam, she asked to move to the back seat to make some calls. We stopped briefly. She climbed back. I pulled out again. Less than a minute had passed when she shouted. I looked in the mirror before she finished the sentence. There was a car behind us on the dam. The distance between us and it was wrong. Closing faster than distance closes when someone is simply driving. It was moving with the specific momentum of a vehicle being pushed as hard as it will go by a person with one purpose. And it was covering the open stretch of the dam in the particular way of something that has no intention of stopping. I pressed the accelerator. The car was not built for this. An old Mazda, small and low, with an engine that performs adequately on a normal day and reveals its limits on a day like this one. The road climbed toward a hill, and my speed climbed with it. Past what I was comfortable with, past what felt safe, the needle moving into territory I had no previous experience navigating, while a frightened woman breathed in my back seat and my friend sat rigidly silent, and the car behind us filled more of my mirror with every second. He caught us before the hill. He tried to pass on the incline. This is the detail I still find most difficult to process when I revisit it. The straightforward recklessness of it. Because there was oncoming traffic coming downhill toward us, visible, and he pulled out anyway. He pulled out and then, at the last possible moment, pulled back behind us. The gap between his car and the oncoming traffic measured in fractions of seconds rather than feet. Then he floored it again as the road leveled at the top. We were doing over 80. I know this because I checked the gauge, and then immediately looked away, because looking away was the better use of my attention. The road was no longer the road I knew. It had become something narrow and serious, demanding everything I had, and what I had was not enough for the situation. He pulled in front of me. His brake lights came on without warning, the red of them filling my windshield, and I had no time for anything deliberate. I swerved. The wheels went briefly onto the shoulder, and I felt the car slip from under me in that specific way that communicates that you are no longer fully in control of the machine you're sitting in. And then somehow the road came back. The wheels found pavement. We stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then he was out of his car, screaming before his door was fully open. The sound arriving ahead of him, raw and directionless in the way of rage that has passed the point of having an object and become simply a condition. He was pointing at the back seat, at her, demanding she come out, demanding she return to him. And the words he used, and the way he used them, told me more about what those children had been riding in that car, than any single detail she had told us. She was crying again. She looked at us, then at his car, the back seat of which held her children, and I watched something tear in her face as she made the calculation she was going to keep making for years. The one that weighed her own safety against her children's, and arrived at the same answer every time. She opened the door and got out. We asked if she wanted us to stay, if she wanted us to call someone, if there was anything left we could do. She told us to leave. She said, "Please don't call the police." And the plea in it was the plea of someone who has learned from experience that a certain kind of help makes things worse. I didn't know how to argue with that knowledge from inside the car I was sitting in. She went to his car and opened the back door, and her children were there. And she put her arms around them and held on. I could see this through my windshield, and I did not look away. He was still shouting, now at her, now at us, gesturing for us to go. And she turned once and looked back. The look on her face was not simple, not just fear or gratitude or the blankness of someone shut down by adrenaline. It was complicated. In the specific ways situations are complicated, when the person at the center of them understands things about their situation that no one on the outside can fully grasp. She motioned for us to leave. I drove. My friend and I didn't speak for a while. There was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying more accurately. I drove until I found a farmhouse about a mile down the road. I pulled in because I needed to stop. Needed to put the car in park and let my hands come off the wheel. Needed to breathe in a place that wasn't moving. We went inside and called the police. We gave them everything we had. The make and description of the car, the direction, the time, the location, her physical description, the children, the blood. The officer was patient, thorough, careful with his questions, and thanked us when it was done. After that, nothing. No follow-up, no information, no call telling us what had been found, whether the car had been located, what had become of the woman with blood on her shirt and children in the back seat. The case closed around us, and we were left outside of it, which is where people who make phone calls and give statements are left when the official world moves forward without them. That uncertainty has never resolved. I have never known whether she got out, whether the children are safe, whether the distance between that afternoon on the dam and her life now is measured in recovery, or in something worse. The not knowing is its own particular weight. Different from grief, different from fear. More like a question asked too many times to expect an answer. That has become simply a permanent resident in the back of the mind. What I think about most is not the chase, though the chase is vivid and accessible whenever I allow it to surface. What I think about is the moment she climbed out of the car, the calculation she made with her children in his back seat and her blood on her shirt and two strangers in front of her who wanted to help, but could not give her the thing she needed most, which was a version of this situation where the help didn't come with consequences she'd have to live with long after we drove away. Domestic violence had existed for me before that afternoon the way most things exist before they become personal. As a known fact about the world, something that appeared in news stories and statistics and conversations held at a safe remove. And then it climbed into my car and bled on the seat and asked me to drive. And it became something I have carried ever since as a physical memory. Located in the body, in the hands that gripped the wheel, in the chest that held a heart pounding at a register it was never designed for. I hope she is safe. I have hoped this for 10 years, with the specific quality of hope that exists for things you cannot verify. Things that have no update, things that ended for you at a farmhouse a mile down the road while the story continued for someone else. It is a quiet hope, maintained without expectation. The kind you keep not because it changes anything, but because setting it down entirely feels like a form of abandonment. The dam is still there. People still run along it, fish from its edges, bring their children to look at the water. It is still an ordinary road that locals use without thinking. The way you use places that have been familiar long enough to stop requiring attention. I think about her every time. There are stories that stay outside of you, that you can pick up and set down, that exist at a manageable distance, even when they are sad or terrible. You read them, you feel something, you carry on. And then there are stories that get inside you before you realize what's happening, that arrange themselves along the streets you drive every day and the landscapes you thought you knew, that attach themselves to faces you have actually seen and hands you have actually shaken. Daniel Morecambe's story is the second kind for me. It has never been something I could hold at arm's length. It was always too close, threaded too deeply into the fabric of ordinary life, woven into places and routines and faces in ways that made the distance that should exist between a person and a tragedy like this simply unavailable. Now I want to explain what I mean by that. But first, I need to tell you what happened. Daniel was 13 years old. It was the lead up to Christmas. That particular time of year when the whole atmosphere of childhood feels animated by anticipation. Presents to think about. School almost done, the world carrying a warmth that makes ordinary things feel festive. He left his house to walk down to the bus stop near his home. He was going to catch the bus to the shops to buy Christmas presents for his family. This is the detail I have never been able to move past without stopping. Christmas presents for his family. He was thinking about them. He was doing something kind. He was 13 years old, and he was thinking about what to get the people he loved. And he walked down to the bus stop, and he never came home. The bus he was meant to take was delayed. He stood at the stop and waited. While he waited, A car pulled up. There were people around. This is important, and I will come back to it. The abduction did not happen in an isolated place on a deserted road. In a location where the absence of witnesses was the condition of possibility. It happened in the open, in daylight, in a place with people nearby. Witnesses saw a boy being taken. Some saw him struggling. Some heard voices raised, and no one moved. Not because they were cowards, not because they didn't care, but because of something more ordinary and more terrible than either of those things. They each believed that someone else would act. They looked at a situation that required a response, and they outsourced the response to the room, to the collective, to the assumed other adult who would surely step in. And in that collective assumption, in that gap between the responsibility everyone felt and the action no one took, Daniel was put into a car and driven away. He was 13 years old. It was the week before Christmas. He was thinking about presents for his family. His parents spent 8 years not knowing. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because I think it's easy to read it and let it pass. 8 years, nearly a decade during which Bruce and Denise Morecambe woke up every morning into the same absence. The same unanswered question, the same suspended grief that could not complete itself. Because without a body, without certainty, hope and despair existed simultaneously and with equal force. They went to prisons, sat across from inmates, and listened to things no parent should ever have to hear. Rumors, and claimed knowledge about what had been done to their child, with no way to evaluate the truth of any of it. No way to know which details were real, and which were the product of malice or manipulation, or the particular cruelty of people who have already done the worst thing and find secondary pleasure in prolonging it. 8 years of that. 8 years of missing posters and memorials and candlelight vigils and a community holding space for child who might still be somewhere, who might still be found, who might still come home. 8 years of a grief that had no floor, that could not reach the bottom of itself because the information that would allow it to do so had been deliberately withheld. Eventually, a tip, eventually an arrest. The man taken in had 4 children of his own, the kind of detail the mind turns away from, but cannot entirely avoid because it says something about the capacity of an ordinary surface to conceal whatever is living beneath it. He protected his accomplices even then, refused to give them up. But he told police what had happened to Daniel. The confession contained no motive in any sense the word usually carries. No money involved, no personal history, no grievance being settled, no ideology being served. They had wanted to know what it was like to kill a child. When they saw Daniel at the bus stop, they saw an opportunity to find out. They abducted him, drove him to a forest, walked him deeper inside, away from roads and light and any possibility of being heard. They cut off his ear. Then they killed him. They left his remains in the bush and drove away, and the forest closed over what they had done. And 8 years passed. When Daniel's remains were found, it did not bring peace. I want to be honest about that, because I think there is a narrative that investigation and discovery and resolution offer something that functions like an ending, a place where grief can finally land and begin the work of becoming survivable. What the discovery brought was different. It brought answers, which are not the same as comfort. It confirmed what hope had been holding at bay for 8 years. It gave the grief a floor, and the grief hit that floor hard. Now I need to explain why this is not, for me, a story about something that happened somewhere else to people I read about. I was born in the same town as the man who killed Daniel. That fact arrived in my life like something cold and physical when I understood it. The recognition that the geography of my earliest existence overlapped with the geography of his, that we had both drawn our first breath in the same place. Later, my family moved. We moved to the state where Daniel had lived, to the area where he had been abducted, where his remains had been found. These were not locations I encountered on a map or in a news report. They were the streets I moved through, the landmarks I passed regularly enough that they had stopped registering as landmarks and had become background. I met Daniel's parents more than once, both before and after his remains were found. I am aware that anything I say about this risks sounding like something it isn't, like a claim to grief that belongs to others. I want to be careful about that. What I can say is what I witnessed. I saw people carrying something that should not fit inside a human life, and carrying it anyway, because there was no alternative, because the world had continued to require things of them, even after it had taken the thing that made those requirements bearable. They were kind. They were present. They were doing the impossible work of remaining in the world, while a piece of the world that had been theirs was permanently gone. Witnessing that kind of endurance is its own form of education, though not one anyone would choose. I attended Daniel's funeral. His twin brother carried the coffin. I have never found the words adequate to that image, and I have stopped trying to find them. There are things that exist beyond the reach of language, that resist being made into sentences, that when you try to compress them into words, simply press back against the compression and remain what they are, which is unbearable. A boy carrying his twin's coffin is one of those things. I watched it happen, and I have never stopped watching it happen. Not really, because it is the kind of image that does not agree to become the past. It stays present. It insists on remaining close. Before I knew any of this, I had camped in the forest where Daniel's remains were found. I had been there, slept in that place, moved through it in the ordinary way of a person moving through a piece of bush that is just a piece of bush, experiencing it as peaceful and unremarkable in the way wilderness feels peaceful and unremarkable when you have no knowledge of what has happened inside it. When I learned what that ground had held, the memory rearranged itself. The same images, the same sensory details of that place, now existing inside a completely different frame. And the frame changed everything. The quality of the quiet was different in retrospect. The depth of the trees was different. What had been peaceful became something else entirely. And I understood for the first time how completely our experience of a place depends on what we know about it. How the same physical space can be two entirely different things, depending on the knowledge you bring to it. Every morning I was driven to school. The route traced what I came to think of as a timeline. At the end of my street, the motel where those men had stayed. We passed it without comment, my family and I, but I knew what it was, and knowing was enough. Then the memorial at the bus stop, the place where Daniel had stood waiting, where the seconds had passed in which someone should have acted and did not. Marked now with flowers and tributes, the community's attempt to leave something at the place where everything had been taken. And then the forest, just visible from the road. The trees that had received what those men had done and held it for 8 years without giving anything back. All of it on a single route. All of it passed every morning on the way to school. There was no version of ordinary available to me on those drives. No way to let the familiar become invisible again once you knew what the familiar contained. I was a child and then a teenager trying to understand something that resists understanding. Something the mind keeps approaching from different angles in the hope that one of them will yield a way in, a point of comprehension. that makes it possible to file the thing away and move on. The question I could not stop returning to was the simplest and most impossible one.
Why?
Not why in the sense of motive, because the confession had already stripped away the comfort of motive. Why in the deeper sense, how the world had allowed this to be a thing that happened. How 3 people could look at a 13-year-old boy standing at a bus stop, thinking about Christmas presents, and arrive at the decision they arrived at. How that was something human beings were capable of doing. How the category of human beings that contained Daniel's parents and Daniel's twin brother and the community that lit candles and searched for 8 years also contained the people who took him into a forest and did what they did. I have been sitting with that question for a long time. I do not have an answer. What I have instead is the understanding that the question is the point, that the refusal of evil to be comprehensible is itself a form of information about what evil is. It is not the dark version of something we understand. It is the thing that understanding fails against. It is what is left when all the frameworks we use to make the world navigable simply stop working. The bystander effect has a name and a clinical description and a body of psychological research behind it. And none of that makes it easier to sit with when you apply it to a specific afternoon and a specific bus stop. The research explains the mechanism. It does not explain the seconds themselves. The particular texture of each individual hesitation, the moment when each person chose, in whatever form that choice took, to wait. I think about those witnesses sometimes. I think about what they carried afterward. Whether the knowledge of what had happened to Daniel changed their relationship to their own hesitation on that afternoon, whether they lay awake with it. I think they must have. I think that kind of knowledge does not agree to stay where you put it. What I'm left with, after years of living in proximity to this story and the people whose lives it is actually made of, is not a lesson in any clean sense. Lessons imply a transaction, imply that the terrible thing has produced something usable, something that compensates even partially for what it cost. I don't think that's what this is. What it is instead is a permanent alteration in how I see ordinary things. A bus stop, a forest, a motel at the end of a street, the lead up to Christmas, that busy, hopeful time. A boy walking out of his house to do something kind for the people he loved. The ordinariness of the beginning of that day is what I cannot get past, even now. The way it started as something thousands of children do every day. The way it looked from the outside, like nothing more than a boy going to the shops. The way there was nothing in any visible detail of that morning that suggested what was coming. That is the thing that stays. Not the horror of the ending, though the horror of the ending is always present. The normality of the beginning, the way the ordinary world contains these things inside it. Hidden, patient, indistinguishable from everything around them until the moment when they are not. The way Daniel's world looked like safety and was not safe. The way the forest looked like a forest and held what it held. There is a boy who should be alive. He would be in his mid-30s now. He might have children of his own. He might have given Christmas presents to his parents every year. And his parents might have complained lovingly about not needing anything while treasuring whatever he brought, the way parents do. His twin brother might not have had to carry something that no one should have to carry. There might have been an ordinary life, unremarkable and irreplaceable, unfolding across the years. That life did not happen. That is the center of this. The fact that cannot be softened or reframed or made to yield anything except the acknowledgement of its own weight. Daniel Morecambe was 13 years old. He was thinking about Christmas presents for his family. He walked to a bus stop on an ordinary morning, and he never came home. And the same world where his parents woke up every day for 8 years into the same absence, the same world where his twin brother grew up without him, kept going, as worlds do, as they always do, indifferently, relentlessly, as if nothing had been broken. Something had been broken. Something is still broken. I do not think it will be repaired. There is a version of my life that ended on the night before Easter in the late 1990s. I don't mean that as a figure of speech. I mean that there was a specific sequence of events already in motion that night, already assembling itself on a stretch of road I would have been on. And the only reason I wanted it comes down to something I still cannot explain and have stopped trying to explain in any satisfying way. It was a feeling, an ordinary, unremarkable, inexplicable feeling, and it kept me alive. College in those years had a particular texture I can still access when I think hard enough. The business of it, the sense that everything was simultaneously temporary and permanent. That the friendships and the routines and the late nights were both something you were passing through, and something that would last forever. I was juggling classes and papers, and a social life that felt essential in the way only a 20-year-old social life feels essential. 2 of my closest friends were sisters who lived on the outskirts of town, far enough that getting there required a minor commitment. Not just a walk down the street. I had known them long enough that their house had become one of those places that felt like an extension of my own. The kind of place you could arrive at without warning. Walk into the kitchen, sit down, and find yourself deep in conversation about nothing and everything before you had quite registered that the evening had begun. Both of them worked at Pizza Hut. The younger one as a cook, the older one training as a manager. Their schedules ran late, especially on weekends. But they had a gift for making time feel elastic, for making you feel like there was always room at the table, and always something worth talking about. The night before Easter that year, I was alone in my room working on a paper due the following Monday. This was before laptops had become the assumed standard, so I was typing on a word processor, saving carefully and often, the way you do when you have experienced enough technological betrayal to never again take a saved document for granted. I had been at it for hours and reached the stage of staring where the words stop looking like words and become arrangements of letters with no particular meaning. My brain had hit its limit and was signaling this by making everything I'd written seem simultaneously adequate and irredeemably flat. I needed a break, not just a change of position or a glass of water, a genuine interruption, the kind that comes from leaving the room and being somewhere else for a while. The sisters came to mind immediately, as they often did when I needed exactly that kind of easy, undemanding company. I thought about their kitchen table, the particular quality of their house at night, the way an hour there could reset something in me that solitary breaks never could. I decided to go. I closed down the word processor, got up, changed my clothes, ran something through my hair, made myself look like a person who had made a deliberate choice to go out rather than one defeated by a paper. The getting ready process took about half an hour. Nothing unusual, no urgency, no anxiety, no resistance. I was simply a person preparing to visit friends, performing the ordinary steps in the ordinary order. My mind already half at their kitchen table. I put on my shoes. I pulled on my coat. I checked the time. I walked to my bedroom door, reached out, and closed my hand around the doorknob. What happened next is the part that has never resolved itself into language that feels adequate to it. In the time it takes to draw a single breath, something changed. Not gradually, not the way tiredness creeps up over an evening. This was immediate. A wave of exhaustion, total and heavy, that seemed to arrive from outside rather than rising from within, as though something had reached in and removed whatever it is that makes you capable of moving forward. Every intention I had of opening that door and walking through it simply ceased to be available. Not suppressed, not reconsidered, gone. I stood there with my hand on the knob and the coat on my back and my shoes on my feet. And I could not explain what I was feeling. I remember the confusion of it, the mild, detached puzzlement of a person whose body has just done something unexpected without consulting them. I was not frightened. I was not receiving any message I interpreted as significant. I was just standing at a door I suddenly lacked the capacity to open. And after a moment, I shrugged at myself the way you do when something minor doesn't add up, and I let go. I hung up the coat. I took off the shoes. I went back to the desk, but my eyes wouldn't find the paper again. So I gave up and went to bed. The decision registered as nothing, a small, mildly strange moment in an ordinary Saturday night. The kind that vanishes completely unless something happens later to call it back. The phone call came the next morning. I knew before the words arrived, from the quality of the voice, from the particular way a person breathes when they are carrying something too heavy to set down gently. The sisters had been in a crash. The older one was gone, dead on impact. The younger one was alive, but the word the caller used alongside alive was the kind that makes alive sound like its own kind of damage. I sat with the phone in my hand after the call ended and looked at the wall. The information was there, completely assembled, grammatically clear, and I could not make it real. The mind does that with certain things, receives them, processes them, and cannot convert them into the form that allows you to feel them all at once. You feel them in pieces, over time, in the days and weeks that follow, as the reality keeps arriving in small, unbearable installments. The details emerged over the following hours. The younger sister had been working that night. Her shift ended around 1 in the morning. She didn't have a car. The older sister, who had the night off, had done what she always did on those nights. She had gone to pick her up. The simple act of an older sister who took care of things. They were on their way home when it happened. The crash was not the kind you walk away from shaken and grateful. It was the other kind. Catastrophic. The older sister never had a chance. The detail that came later, offered by someone who had it from the emergency responders, is the one I have never been able to fully put down. When they arrived at the car, the older sister's hands were gripped around the steering wheel so tightly. The reflex of those final seconds locked into her muscles that they could not remove them. They had to break her fingers to get her free. I have never stopped being able to picture that specific image. What those final moments must have held for her. The awareness arriving just fast enough to tighten her hands. And then the nothing after. The younger sister survived. This is not a small thing. Survival in her case required extraordinary medical intervention and a recovery that lasted, in one form or another, for years. Her pelvis was shattered. She did not walk for more than 12 months. One thing the doctor noted, in the careful language of medical professionals, finding something in a terrible situation that functions as explanation, was that she may have survived in part because she had fallen asleep in the car. Her body was relaxed at the moment of impact. Whether that is fully true or simply the most available comfort, I don't know. But it was true that she slept in cars easily, had always fallen asleep on long rides, and that this small, ordinary habit may have been the difference between the story. She got to keep living, and the one her sisters ended on. It was not until the full shape of that night had been drawn for me that I understood where I had been standing in it. If I had gone, if I had opened that door, walked down to my car, made the drive out to their house on the outskirts of town, I would have been there when the older sister left to pick up the younger one from her shift. There is no version of that in which I don't go with her. That was simply how things worked among us. You were there, you went together. That was the rhythm of things. I would have been in that car, on that road, in that impact. Based on what happened to the older sister, I would not have survived. This is not a dramatic conclusion I'm reaching for. It is the arithmetic of the situation laid out plainly. The older sister was in the driver's seat and died instantly. I would have been a passenger, and a crash that killed the driver and shattered the pelvis of a person relaxed at the moment of impact would not have left room for a third person to walk away. I would have been 20 years old, and I would have been done. I have sat with this knowledge for more than 20 years. In the early period, it was acute. The kind of awareness that interrupts ordinary activities, that makes a cup of coffee feel surreal because you are holding it and your hand is attached to your body and your body is present in a morning that you should not, by the logic of one specific night, have lived to see. The guilt came with it. The guilt survivors carry, that has no satisfying logic but does not require logic to be real. Why her and not me? Why me and not her? Questions that have no answers but ask themselves anyway, loudly at inconvenient times, for longer than you expect. The thing that settled into something permanent. Something that has not gone away in the way the acute pain eventually went away, is the memory of standing at the door, the coat on my back, the shoes on my feet, my hand on the knob. 30 minutes of preparation, no hesitation, a decision made and acted upon, and then a single breath in which something removed my ability to follow through. Nothing dramatic, no vision, no voice, no clear signal that could be pointed to and named. Just a feeling that arrived suddenly and completely and changed the night. I have thought about this from enough angles to have exhausted most of the explanations. Ordinary exhaustion accumulated over a long week, triggered finally by the act of standing up and preparing to go out. The body asserting a need the conscious mind had not yet registered. Pure coincidence. A moment of fatigue that happened to occur at a moment that happened to matter. I cannot rule any of these out. I also cannot make them feel complete. They explain the mechanism maybe, but they don't explain the quality of it. The totality, the way it arrived like something from outside rather than rising from within. The older sister had said, over the years more than once, in the casual way of something that has become a recurring joke that isn't quite a joke, that she wouldn't live to see 30. People who knew her had heard it enough times that it had become part of how they thought about her. One of those things a person says that everyone files away without taking seriously. She died 1 month before her 30th birthday. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with any of it. Not in the sense of making it cohere into something that explains itself. What I have instead is the memory of a doorknob and a coat and 30 minutes of ordinary preparation, and of a feeling that stopped me with my hand already reaching. What I have is a friend who is gone and a younger sister who eventually walked again, and a morning after phone call that rearranged the way I understood the relationship between small decisions and large outcomes. Some nights, even now, I find myself thinking about the version of that night where I pushed through the feeling, where I told myself I was being ridiculous, opened the door, walked to my car, made the drive, sat at their kitchen table and talked. and then rode along to pick up the younger sister. Because of course I would have. And the road came up to meet us all. And that was the end of the story I was in. That version of the night is real in some way I can't fully dismiss. It was the version that was in progress. That had been planned. That required only the turning of a knob to begin. What stopped it was nothing I can name with confidence. Nothing I would know how to reproduce or recognize in advance. I only know that I let go of the doorknob, that I took off my shoes and hung up my coat and went to bed. And that in the morning, the world was still a place I was in. I have never fully understood why. I have stopped expecting to.